Hello, welcome everybody to the first One World seminar of 2024. Let me get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. So if you could, please put your questions in the Q&A down at the bottom. We'll handle them in the order that they come in, so feel free to go ahead and put your questions in during the presentation, so that way you know that we'll get to it. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anybody's name as I'm reading your question. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, we're pleased to welcome Arturo Hernandez from the University of Houston. Arturo has numerous awards and funding from both NIH and NSF. He has learned 4 languages in his life, which has influenced his interest in second language acquisition and bilingual language processing research. Today, he'll be speaking about this and the development of a new theoretical framework. Arturo, we're thrilled to have you here. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction. It's great to be here. I guess good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. The interest in the bilingual brain, I sort of, the 4 languages is sort of where I could pick up. So I grew up simultaneous, bilingual Spanish, English, spent time in Mexico as a kid, in the summers I would go, and then that was the summer camp. And then during the year I would study here in the US. And then at 14, I lived there for a year with my aunt. And at 20, I decided to learn to pursue my interest in Brazilian Portuguese. My mom always wanted me to learn French. That's the language. My parents are both immigrants to the US from Mexico. And so that's the language they learned at the time, as the second language was French. And my mom always wanted me to learn that, but I had other ideas and decided to learn Brazilian Portuguese. And it was really at the age of 20 when I learned when I went to Brazil and got immersed in Portuguese, that I really got interested in this field. It was kind of only 2 years later that I realized that this was what I was going to study. But when I learned Brazilian Portuguese, I suddenly had trouble communicating. And this is actually now documented, that people who go abroad seem to lose their native language. In my case, I was losing both my native languages. Spanish became very difficult to talk in, and English also became difficult. And you'd see a lot of us code switching into Portuguese when we're speaking in English, which is very odd, just within a few months. When I came back, I began to read about, when I came back to UC Berkeley to finish my BA, I began to read about bilingual aphasia. And I got really interested in this, in the cases of people who had aphasia, or bilinguals, right, who'd had aphasia and then had these very odd patterns of recovery. So that really fueled my interest in the field. And I said I wanted to know what the answer to that was, because that's what had happened to me, except I had not had aphasia, right? I didn't, it wasn't, I mean, learning a third language is hard, but it's certainly not a neurological insult. And so as I went through the literature, the old bilingual aphasia literature sort of lays out 3 different ways, or 3 different pillars that describe how, what affects recovery of a language. And I won't talk about aphasia. That's my last dream, was to actually, that's why I went to graduate school to study bilingual aphasia. And I think I saw 1 bilingual Alzheimer's patient in my entire graduate school career. And then fMRI appeared shortly thereafter. So you won't see anything about bilingual aphasics, but a lot of the framing of the studies relate back to the old cases of bilingual aphasia. I laid this out in my book, The Bilingual Brain, came out in 2013, more than 10 years ago now. Essentially 3 things, right? One is age of acquisition, when the language is learned, language proficiency, what they used to call familiarity, the idea that a more familiar language would be more resistant to damage, the idea that an early learned language, age of acquisition, would be more resistant to damage. And then third one is that there might be a control mechanism, that people could get stuck in a language or flip between them without being able to stop and stay in one. So the topic of control and bilingualism is one that is really from the 1920s. So it's an old topic, but it's become in the last few years, I want to say the last 10, 15 years, really this topic of what does control do in the life of a bilingual? And specifically, there's been discussion about, does bilingualism itself train some kind of control mechanism? So again, about the time shortly after my book came out, or around that time, there was this big debate about, on the one hand, why bilinguals are smarter. You can see that over here on the left, and on the right, the bitter fight over the benefits of bilingualism. And I made a word cloud. So I decided to take all the abstracts that had bilingual aphasia, bilingual cognitive control in them, or bilingual advantage in them. And I created this word cloud. And the word cloud is essentially, the larger the name, the more times that person, that author has the word bilingual advantage in the abstract of that person's paper. And so you can see some of the people that are prominent in this area, including Ellen Bialystok, Ken Papp, Tamar Golan, and various others. I'm down here at the bottom if you're looking for me. So I'm kind of on the very periphery of this debate, so to speak, like literally on the periphery. And then I redid it more recently. So this is from 2016, and then this is more recently in the last few months, looking again. And there are some names that are still recognizable from before, but then some newer ones that you can see that are also related to the bilingual advantage. So it's, again, still a topic of discussion. So what is the hypothesis? So I have to acknowledge my colleague Manolo Carreras, Manolo Carreras, the director of the Basque Center for Brain, Cognition, and Language. And basically, what Manolo told me was that he was running these studies, right? And this is actually, he wasn't the only one. I mean, when I began to talk about this some of our studies that are somewhat related to the bilingual advantage in the early days, what Manolo told me was what I'd heard from other people, which is that they had gone out and run these studies and not found a difference. And so again, he lent me his slides, and I said, well, can I borrow your slides? So I borrowed them, right? And again, the hypothesis is that language training, right, the use of multiple languages, people say either inhibit the irrelevant language, ignore irrelevant information, or you have to monitor there are many different mechanisms that have been used to describe what it is, or you're switching between languages, and that somehow this switching or inhibition or monitoring relates to some kind of general purpose cognitive control. And therefore, this general purpose cognitive control gets trained by being bilingual. That's the idea. So it's from language to other cognitive domains. It's kind of a long story, but I'll go back to this slide for a second, because the literature on the bilingual advantage, as far as I can tell, is actually dates back to the 1930s, where there was this literature that suggested that bilinguals had lower IQ than monolinguals. Those studies were criticized for many years until about the 1960s, when Peel and Lambert published a study that's widely cited, showing that, if anything, bilinguals seemed to be scoring higher, but really there was no difference. But if anything, it was higher in bilinguals. And that's the 1960s. And then in the late 1980s, Ellen Bialystok picks up the idea again in a series of papers on metalinguistic processing, bilingualism. But it's really not until 2004, and the reason I sort of lay out that history is I have a paper submitted that working with colleagues, Claudia von Bastian, Adam Winsler, and Ken Papp, where we kind of lay out a trajectory of time of this discussion of this hypothesis, and then on the other side, what the resolution is. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the resolution as we get into the end of the talk, what I think, or what we think, is a possible resolution. But this is really the study that set it off, right? That got everybody interested in the topic. And this was, again, looking at the Simon effect. So the Simon effect is essentially, there are various versions, but one version is something like, you look at a green or a red square, and if it's green, you press the right button, and if it's red, you press the left button. And of course, the square appears on the side of the screen, so the side can match the side of the button press by color, or not. And if it matches, people are faster than if it doesn't match. So the idea is that this is a measure of some kind of, it's like, I think of it as a spatial Stroop kind of effect. You could think of it that way. That's how I think of it. But the point is that when it's congruent, the side that the button you have to press and the side that it appears on are congruent. People are faster than when it's not congruent. And in this study, there were young and older adult monolinguals and bilinguals. The young were middle-aged. They weren't young. They were middle-aged. They were younger. And the older adults were, again, over 65, right? So it's younger versus older adults, monolingual versus bilingual, and the white is congruent and the bluish bar is incongruent. And so what you can see is, I don't want to do that, sorry. What you can see is that the monolinguals, right, show this, what we'd expect it to be a congruency effect, the same with the bilinguals. And you see it in the older adults, but notice that the bilinguals show us less of an interference effect. So the congruency effect is smaller for the middle-aged bilinguals compared to monolinguals, and the older adult bilinguals compared to monolinguals. So again, I think, as far as I can tell, the most recent modern version of the discussion of this hypothesis originates in 2004, but really it goes back to 1930, and it's gone through a couple of waves. So Manolo graciously offered to lend me his slides, because when he ran his studies, he says he couldn't find any differences, and they looked for them, right? And so what I'm going to do is show you a series of experiments that they ran in the Basque Country. And in those experiments, you're going to see differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. They'll be coded red or green at different ages. So these are studies with children, with young adults, and with older adults. And it's going to be very fast, because these are Manolo's and the work with him, of his work and with his colleagues. And so I'm not going to present them, but I do want you to see that there's a sort of very clear pattern that appears across all these multiple studies. So here goes. So then again, red and green are the different groups. And again, there. And those are young adults. And these are older adults. So I'll see if I can do this one more time, just because it's very fast. So here goes one more time, just green and red. You'll see that there aren't any differences. Stroop, right? Different verbal Stroop, right? Nonverbal Stroop, all with children and young adults, verbal Stroop, nonverbal Stroop, older adults, verbal Stroop, nonverbal Stroop. And they've run other studies. These are just, of course, a sample of those. And again, so the point that he's made across, and his colleagues have made across various papers, is that we just don't know if there is what the advantage might be, if there is one, because a lot of studies don't find it. We kind of went on we took a different route to talk about this. We thought of, this is again work that my colleague Christian Fiebach had done, looking at switching so this was a switching task, right? So it was a cognitive switching task. It was task switching, and it was not with bilinguals. It was with monolinguals. But the interesting thing about this is that he had found that this polymorphism, this DRD2 gene, the A1 plus polymorphism, that people who had A1 plus polymorphism showed reduced switching effects. And this polymorphism is associated with subcortical dopamine. So the interesting sort of idea was, when I read this work and I talked to him about it, was that these genes are not, they're ones that people are born with, and they're associated with task switching. they're not necessarily language genes, right? You could describe them in all sorts of different ways, but again, dopamine is not specifically associated with language specifically, right? It's associated with a lot of different things, cognitive flexibility, reward, et cetera, et cetera. And so one idea that we had here was to look at the DRD2 gene in relation to bilingualism, right? So could you do something like a 2x2? So the first study we did was just to gather the proportion or how many of our population of bilinguals and monolinguals had this particular proportion. And generally what was found at the time in the literature was that about a third of people had the A1 plus and then the others didn't, right? So it's about a third to 2/3. But in fact, what we found was a different effect, such that the bilinguals actually had a greater proportion. Now, I do want to describe the population because I think it's important to talk about bilingualism. We can use that as an umbrella term, but obviously there are different types of bilinguals. And so the ones that we tested here at the University of Houston generally speak Spanish at home, learn English at school, and across time become dominant in English. So they become, because they go to school in English, English becomes their dominant language, even though it is the second language. So that is, and they're different words. We call them sequential bilinguals, early sequential bilinguals. People call them English language learners or dual language learners in the education literature. And then they also call them heritage speakers. That's another, heritage Spanish speakers is another word used more in the second language acquisition literature. So they're different labels, and I just want to make it clear that this particular type of bilingual. In the second study, the one on the bottom, we found that if we looked at age of acquisition, language proficiency, and this gene, right, the polymorphisms of this gene, what we would find is that there was a differential role in cognitive control and picture naming tasks, such that it became a pretty complex picture. Age of acquisition influenced certain brain areas. So this is brain activity that we're looking at in picture naming tasks, and so did language proficiency. As far as we could tell, the gene played a bigger role in cognitive control tasks, right? Nonverbal cognitive control tasks, not so much in picture naming tasks. So again, there's this sort of differential weighting depending on the type of task and the type of factor that we're looking at that plays a role in the brain activity observed in different types of tasks. So one of the sort of questions was, how could we look at, so a lot of the work on cognitive control in bilingualism, right, is related to behavioral, right, reaction time experiments. That's the bulk of the literature is focused on that. And there's not a lot of work integrating neural and cognitive models. So Ribot is interesting. He's one of the neuropsychologists that first talked about bilingual aphasia. His idea was that there was this law of regression, right? So that memory loss that occurred in some kind of order. It would essentially begin with the most recent types of memory, and it would move down to those that are earliest learned, right? So it's a regression because it's going backwards in time, and the earliest memories are the ones that are most resistant to damage. Now, age of acquisition effects exist in all sorts of different domains, right? They're not specific to bilingualism. So we can see them in music, right? So people who are musicians versus, earlier versus later learners of music, have musical training either earlier or later in life. We can find that there are effects of musical training on nonverbal processing. We've done some work with golf players looking at early acquirers of golf versus later acquirers, finding that they seem to represent information differently, specifically early acquirers of golf or early learners of golf before the age of 10 seem to have more trouble paying attention to individual body parts than the later learners. There's more interference for them. Within language, we see this as well. So category instance naming, when you have to name categories if I give you a category fruit, you're going to name a banana, an apple. You're probably going to name, well, we won't use olive because that's actually a weird one, right? But something like pomegranate will be much later, right? Because it's a later acquired fruit. That's the idea. Same with word completion, more likely to fill in words. If you get a word blanks with some letters in between, more likely to fill in a word that's earlier acquired. In lexical decision, you also see that effect, and also between language, right? So again, early learned languages, right, show differences compared to later learned languages. Along with Ping Li, we proposed this idea that early learning might be more sensory motor and later learning might be more cognitive or less sensory motor. And the interesting thing about this was sort of on the side, this became a side project when I was thinking about age of acquisition. But one thing that I had not noticed as much, at least not overtly, was that there's this kind of age of acquisition effect in English, which lines up with different types of word class or the etymology or the origin of words. So, and the reason this happened, which is kind of an odd reason to notice this about English, was that when I was 35, I took it upon myself. I'd been doing work, collaboratively in Germany and spent time there. My children started to enroll in German school, or we enrolled them in German school when we were back in the US, and they had classes for adults. So for a while, about 7 years, I went to German class on Saturdays, and my kids would go as well. And so what I noticed, it was just really hard to learn the language. Now, of course, there are many different reasons why it might have been hard to learn. One, of course, German is not easy. It has a lot of different case markings and other things that English and Spanish don't have, especially the case markings. Those are much more complex. The words get really long. They have, different types of markings on it. They have a pretty complex phonological system. So there are lots of reasons that I would find German hard. But I found it hard for a particular reason. And the particular reason was I couldn't say words. Like I could not form new words. And I felt that at least in Portuguese, which was the other language I had learned as an adult, I could at least kind of get close. I might not get it perfect because Portuguese and Spanish are not identical, but I could get close enough. And then, of course, then I could correct it. And there are these subtle differences between Portuguese and Spanish that Spanish speakers, well, especially Portuguese speakers, know, right, that Spanish speakers make these types of errors. But with German, I just couldn't say. So I was very confused. I could not form words. So then I began to think about English, and some people, and I began to realize that when I was speaking German, I had to speak, at least for me, English without any Spanish. And so I went back and I looked at English itself, and I began to think about this. And when we look at this, is a result of a first analysis I did, where I looked at the origin of words. These are the 50 most frequent nouns for English monolinguals, right? Not bilinguals. At 18 months, so this is the MacArthur-Bates Communication Developmental Inventory, right? So the 50 most frequent nouns. Adult everyday language, this is American soap operas. So we took this as adult everyday kind of language. And then academic language, which is a CELIX. And what you see is this transition from mostly Latin words, right? From Germanic words at 18 months to more Latin words, to then this complete sort of overwhelming overtaking of adult learning in English, which is Latin based. And again, you're wondering, so in my case in particular, having learned Spanish, actually the later high school years of English, vocabulary learning approximated Spanish as well. So it's not just a reinforcement from Spanish to Portuguese, but from Spanish to English as well, for me, in my particular case. And stripping that out and then trying to do it the way Germans do it was really difficult. So hence I just didn't know what the word was for a lot of things. So I followed this up and I said, well, let's look at this across. So this is from a school district in Western Washington State in the United States. And what it is the origin of prefixes and suffixes learned by grade level. So you can see that in English, right, roughly in first grade, it's mostly English or Anglo-Saxon, Old English, or Germanic, whichever word you would like to use, endings like ing. As we move across grade levels and we go from second to third to fourth to fifth to sixth to seventh and to eighth grade, what you begin to see is that more and more Latin and Greek is what's taught in school. And by eighth grade, it's almost entirely Latin and Greek prefixes and suffixes that are being taught. This is Melanie Vasquez, who came in to help in the lab. She had an interesting story because she felt that she came to the US when she was in seventh grade, and she felt that science and math in a way were easier for her because so many of the words were Latin based. So she helped out in the early stages, but really this was a class. And so what had happened across this time was that I had assembled 40,000 words from the English Lexicon Project from Washington University in St. Louis, right? This is an old, very big, large database of words with all kinds of characteristics and reaction times, and both reading times, so word naming times, lexical decision times, and accuracy for 40,000 words, and then non-words. And so what I did is I took that 40,000 word set of words, right, from the English Lexicon Project, and then I combined it with age of acquisition norms in English, so people rating when they had learned the words, and that we ended up with 20,000 words. And so this class I have to thank quite a bit, because in this class we had 20,000 words, and for the class project I decided, well, what if we do the etymology of these 20,000 words? And I thought the class would hate me. But interestingly, they did not hate me, which is good. We did the 20,000 words in class. So people split them up, and then we had people check, and we went through them. But we also learned quite a bit, including the word tuxedo, which Abby Newman here in the bottom right, who's now a graduate student at Georgia Tech. So she actually came in one day and said, this word tuxedo is interesting. I didn't know what it was, and I looked up the etymology, and it turns out that there was a country club and people would wear these fancy suits, and it was in New York in Tuxedo Park. That's my memory of what she told me. And that's why they use the word tuxedo. And so we had so many of these very interesting stories of where the words came from, how the language was composed. They really loved it. I was very happy that they did. I was very surprised too. But then this is the result of all that hard work. So what we find here, so this is the frequency of this of a word, right? So the frequency is here on the y-axis, and this is the rating mean, or the age of acquisition of that word. And what you can see is that words, so the blue are words that are of Anglo-Saxon, we call them Anglo-Saxon origin, and the orange are words of Latin origin. This is in English, right? These are all monolinguals. And so what you find is that early learned words are in fact more Germanic, right? There's kind of this wave here. There are Latinates that come in, or Latinates as they call them in linguistics, that come in fairly early, but really there's this huge wave, and actually it's kind of covered here, but there's this huge wave of Latin words that come in at later ages. So this is by age at the bottom, not by grade level. And you could think of English somehow kind of like this, right? A Germanic base or Old English base, a bit of French in there as well, Latin through French, and then Latin directly, and then of course Greek through Latin as well that comes in. So does this affect reaction time? Well, it turns out that when we look at accuracy, when we look at accuracy, this is results from a crowdsourcing study. So one of the reviewers of the paper suggested we look at crowdsourcing, and the results of the crowdsourcing study show that in fact Germanic, right? So sorry, Yes, Germanic words are more accurately, so people can more accurately make lexical decisions about them than Latinates. But and of course, you notice that monolinguals or native speakers are very, very accurate. They can accurately detect what's a word and not a word. Non-native or L2 English speakers are less accurate. So I just want to make it clear that they are less accurate, but they're more accurate for Latin-based words. So again, non-native speakers are learning English through Latin. Native speakers seem to be learning English through Germanic items or Old English items, Anglo-Saxon items, initially. If we look at reaction time, again, we see differences where Germanic items are significantly faster, right? This is the -1 for monolinguals, slower for Latinates. And then you get this interesting effect as well, but it does not look the same in L2 speakers, right? So the difference seems to be there in terms of reaction time, right? But it's much reduced compared to monolinguals. So these early late differences lay out in English, which is interesting. And I think the interesting thing, and this relates to some extent to work done by Rebecca Treeman at Washington University in St. Louis, which is that there seems to be the sensitivity to the Latin types of spelling and the Anglo-Saxon types of spelling, especially double consonants or not double consonants, seems to be something that pops up as well. And so it's interesting to think about this as a bilingual system, right? At least at the lexical level, where English is in a sense sort of a modern Creole between Latin and German. So in terms of early late differences, going back to the main theme of age of acquisition, the idea of regression, right? So we see it in monolinguals, right? Sort of in terms of what words they use in English and how they're represented. And then in terms of neuroanatomical correlates back to bilinguals, right? The work with Spanish bilinguals, we'd collected over many, many, many years, quite a bit of data showing, different types of fMRI studies. So we'd collected, every time we ran an fMRI study, we'd collect structural data. And so over many, many years, we collected about 160 monolinguals and 200 and something bilinguals. And so we could now, what I called in a separate paper, play God. We actually looked at bilingual, monolingual differences and looked at sample size, finding that in fact, when samples are small, the effects are much larger. The differences when they appear are much larger. So we could actually randomly sample across the different across the different groups, 10 versus 10, 20 versus 20, 30 versus 30, 40 versus 40, all the way up to the full group. So we knew what the full group difference was. And when we looked at the smaller groups, it didn't always match. And sometimes it was in the opposite direction, and it was always inflated in the smaller groups and then in the larger group. So again, the effect sizes grow or grow as the sample size gets smaller. So we could do that. The other thing that Hannah Clausenius Kalman did was to actually look in her master's thesis, which then got published in Human Brain Mapping, at the difference in structure between early and late bilinguals. But she did it with 2 different programs and 3 different measures. And in doing that, she arrived at an interesting pattern of results, which I'll show in a minute. But she also made this slide to summarize the literature. So the literature, this is again looking at differences between early and late. So some studies look at sequential versus simultaneous, using density, volume, or density, and that's by color coded, right? Volume, area, thickness, density, again, density, right? And so you get this large, every study, each one of these are different studies, and each one shows a different result. So again, doesn't seem to be an age of acquisition area, or at least people would disagree on which one it may be, which part of the brain may be affected by age of acquisition or, correlated with age of acquisition. So again, these were the studies these were the group that we had of monolingual, early, late. All the bilinguals were 189. The monolinguals were 145. We also had something like 40 or 30, I think, simultaneous, which are not in this group. That's before the age of 3, which we were not supposed to have simultaneous bilinguals, but 30 of them ended up in our study. So I'm not including them here, but we do have those as well. And when Hannah did and looked at again, so she looked at density, thickness, right? Late versus early, density with ANCOVA, volume, looking at using 2 different programs, FreeSurfer and SPM. So you can see down here, right? SPM for volume and FreeSurfer, there were no AOA effects. It looks like so each program and each measure gives a different area, right? That's sense or correlated with age of acquisition, right? Related to age of acquisition. And when you compare the data that Hannah collected or analyzed with the lit review, it looks actually surprisingly similar, right? So we've essentially, in one study, replicated the literature, showing that, again, it's wide areas and that each one of these measures is capturing some aspect of a brain area that's sensitive to age of acquisition, but there's not a particular brain area. And I think it's important to take that into account. Hannah could easily have split this up into maybe 2 or 3 papers, but she agreed, and I think I felt it was important as her advisor that she published them all together to show that it's not just a simple relationship between brain structure and age of acquisition. So moving on, right? So age of acquisition is just one thing. I did tell you that age of acquisition in our bilinguals is not correlated with language proficiency. In other words, the early learned language Spanish is not more proficient than the late learned or the second language English. This is Petrie's idea. Petrie's had the idea of the law of familiarity, right? So that familiar languages, the language that was most familiar at the time of insult would be more resistant to damage than the less familiar language. So this was Petrie's idea. And so what we were looking at, and we've looked at, again, proficiency in many different types of ways in our studies, but one study that was going back to looking at, which was very fascinating, looking at dopamine levels, is we looked at 2 different genes, the original DRD2, which I talked about earlier, the A1, A minus, A1, A plus, sorry, A1 minus, A1 plus, which is here, right, in the columns, and then in the rows, we see the COMT, right? Then that has to do with cortical dopamine. So again, we get 6 levels of cortical and subcortical dopamine based on these 2 genes. Again, they're 2 genes, so I think we need to be careful about making claims about single genes. But again, they have been associated in multiple studies with different types of dopamine. And then we created this graph. So let me explain exactly what we're doing here. So on the y-axis is bilingual proficiency. Now, this is not a measure of proficiency in each language. It's a measure of how well they speak both languages, right? So again, and proficiency is objective proficiency. So we're looking at picture naming and listening comprehension, 2 measures. We combine that into a score, and then we look at how close those 2 scores are. Now, and how high those scores are. So someone can be relatively balanced. So let's say I'll choose an extreme, 90 and 10, right? So 90 and 10 would give an average of 50. So they could have a 90 in English and a 10 in Spanish, or they could have a 60 and a 40, right? Which would again give them an average of 50. And the person who scored a 60 and a 40 would have a higher average than someone who scored 90 and 10. So this particular measure actually gives a boost when the person is balanced. So it's not just how well they speak a language, but it's also how balanced they are in both. So that's this bilingual proficiency measure. The age of acquisition measure is, of course, when they learn the language. And these 6 lines are regression lines, right, for people who have different combinations of those genes. So again, it's a complicated figure. I do want to make people aware that the regression lines run in the opposite direction here, but really most of our subjects are acquiring English around here. So it's really the forward part that is most interesting to us, and I think most accurate. But it suggests that certain people, right, with certain combinations of these 2 different types of genes have higher proficiency the later they learn a second language, and other people have higher proficiency in both languages the earlier they learn both languages. And we've also taken out of this socioeconomic status. So again, this is a very complex relationship, and it suggests that dopamine has some role in how well bilinguals can learn both and keep both, right? Again, it's not exactly control, but it's a sort of flexibility, and that might interact with when they learn it. Now, I'd just like to remind people, with these factors and the socioeconomic status, we can account for about 30% of the variance. There's a whole other 70% that's not accounted for. So again, it's not that this is a rule that people have to learn it early or late, but it does appear that for some people it's beneficial, more beneficial to learn it earlier. For some, later may lead to better balance, objective proficiency, of course. We're not talking about accent. So we can think of language proficiency as a form of expertise. Bilingual proficiency changes across time, right? And that balanced proficiency affects cognition and interacts with genetics and AOA, which is really, in this case, the genes that have to do with dopamine. And again, these are not language genes, right? They have to do with other types of factors. So when we think about, again, right, this idea of age of acquisition, right, language proficiency and cognitive control, originally when I was thinking about that in terms of bilingualism, I began to try to trace out what this looked like. What was this? How could I see this visually? And so I began to play around with these 2 different figures, and the figure was sort of thinking about what's the difference between early acquisition, if you will, right? Something like this here, where it's very early acquisition, and you have these sort of 2 different language systems that are existing early, combining early, and then you have the cognitive system and the language system forming around it, versus one where the language system is more established, and then the second language system has to kind of somehow connect, right, to this earlier formed language that is much more, formed. And I was trying to come up with an analogy. For a while, I was thinking about planets, but I didn't really want to use the idea that, it's like a collision, like a planetary collision, because, planetary collisions are not usually good things for planets. Really, what I thought was it's more of a biological process, right? And in my book, The Bilingual Brain, I sort of describe it. I describe bilingualism and language as a sort of 2 species in an ecosystem, right? So they kind of have to work things out. They may share resources, they may compete for resources, right? But they have to exist within this ecosystem. And my colleague Ping Li, who designed very early studies of DevLex and DevLex 2, which simulated, right, bilingualism in a sort of neural network kind of model, said that that's exactly what it seemed to be happening, that the languages seemed to be kind of trying to sort out and trying to work through a structure, right? And so what I had captured in this analogy of an ecosystem, he had seen in his models, right? Similarly. So what is this neuroemergentist, right? Neurocomputational emergentism. Well, emergentism, right? John Stuart Mill, although there are many others that have been credited with, but his example, right? John Stuart Mill, a philosopher, English philosopher, describes, right, oxygen and hydrogen. Right? So he says oxygen and hydrogen exist as gases. When they combine, they change. So they become something else. They become a liquid, right? I guess a solid, depending on the temperature. Elizabeth Bates, my doctoral advisor, right, described the neck of a giraffe, right? So her analogy for language and evolution, right, related to language, was think about a giraffe's neck, right? A giraffe's neck is adapted to eating, right, feeding at great heights, right? And it has to do all the network, right? It has close to, if not the same number of bones as other mammals, right? It has to do all of the neck work that other necks do. But notice one thing that's interesting, which is that the entire organism has to shift around to accommodate, right? Or to deal with this change. So the change in the neck is not just a change in the neck, it's the entire system, including the cardiovascular system, to feed this very long neck has to also adapt. And this fits in a lot with the ideas of emergentism, a lot with Bates and McWhinney and Bates competition model, right? Where they talked about cue competition in time and looked at language development and the use of sentence processing and grammatical learning as having to do with this type of a process. And then more recently, in the unified model, Brian McWhinney's brought together this idea with thinking of L1 or first language and second language, L2 acquisition, as being along a continuum. And can we describe it within a unified model of both types of processes? So for some time now, right, I've kept thinking about the question of the bilingual cognitive advantage, the question that sort of drove the beginning of this talk, right, which is, is there somehow that bilingual training leads to changes in cognitive, control? And during this talk, I've sort of shown you this side literature on dopamine and on flexibility, and a lot of the language that's used within this literature, right? Reward-based learning, reinforcement learning, cognitive flexibility. A lot of this type of language is really different than the control language that's used in the bilingual literature. And so I began to read this literature, and I encountered this model from Andrea Stocco and colleagues, the conditional routing model. So the conditional routing model, which is at the bottom, right, essentially is a model between the prefrontal cortex and various subcortical structures, with the idea that a lot of having to learn new things involve the basal ganglia has to sort of train the prefrontal cortex in a way, if you want to use that word. I'll use the word train. I don't want to be too directional because everything's multi-directional in the brain, but that there's a relationship between striatal prefrontal connectivity and learning something new. And that when somebody learns something new, which is what bilinguals do when they learn a language, that language learning might affect this prefrontal striatal connectivity. And Stocco and colleagues have quite a few papers showing that there seems to be a relationship between bilingualism and new rule learning. We also have something, we actually taught bilinguals and monolinguals German words, right? And we chose so Germanic German words, so no words that didn't look like Spanish for the bilinguals. Monolinguals probably wouldn't care, but we wanted to make sure bilinguals were an advantage because we were teaching them a Latin word, a Latinate in German. So we picked only Germanic words. And what we found was that the bilinguals learned the new words, Germanic words, more quickly, and that they were able to react to them more quickly, and that they showed less brain activity, or differential brain activity not less, but differential for new words, newly learned words. So that was interesting. That fits in a little bit with what Stocco and colleagues suggest. The representational plasticity, interestingly, is from Devlex. So I told you about Ping Li's work along with Zhao and Li in 2013, but also Bilex from Peñalosa in 2019, a newer model, which is a self-organizing model looking at representational plasticity. In other words, what are the language, sort of the languagey, if you will, representations in a model? How do they lay out? How does, and Peñalosa has done some really nice work looking at age of acquisition. Devlex does it as well. Zhao and Lee did it as well. Peñalosa, Swati, and Mikulainen have done that work as well with representational plasticity. But I suggest that has to do with the sort of language kinds of representations versus the systems that are involved in flexibly adapting between them. And so I termed this model a Franken model. I call it a Franken model because it's like a Frankenstein, right? Here's a little head, and then here's a little body, in case you were wondering why I put it in that particular order. And how does this model work? What does it do, right? So again, this is again looking at bilex, right? So you have an English phonetic map, a Spanish phonetic map, and the semantic map. And what the model has to do is organize, right? Using Hebbian learning, it's organizing, right, from English, from semantics, basically to phonetics. So it's doing what I would call, and they're able to look at various effects, including recovery from aphasia, age of acquisition effects, can also fit in with this model, so they can model that in their model. And more recently, there have been discussions about trying to integrate these two models, right, into a Franken model, as I showed you earlier. So kind of simulations of a model like this, right, to look at something very basic, right? So again, here's English and Spanish. You have a semantic space. These are colors. Here are the sort of phonological spaces. And the question is, and again, the model, if it sees something, it has to produce. So if it has to produce in Spanish, then the response would be rojo. And so what happens when you put them together, right? And so interestingly, when you put them together, so this was just a proof of concept, right? To look at whether the model could actually pick up colors, and it does. So it can actually recognize the color red, right? So it starts off not recognizing it, but over time, it's able to hone in on red. And it also shows a Stroop effect. So this is, again, a proof of concept. Yes, I know it's not a bilingual model. It doesn't tell us about cognitive control, but it does appear at least that the model that somehow the cognitive flexibility may clean up the representational plasticity to some extent and clean up the representations. So again, this is just a promissory note that we could take this type of model and look at the relationship between cognitive flexibility and representational plasticity. Teilhard de Chardin is I pause for a second because I'm back to emergentism. I think it's fascinating for a number of different reasons, not necessarily related to bilingualism, but Teilhard de Chardin had this idea of an omega point. So he was actually a priest in France in the 1920s who believed in evolution. So you can imagine that a priest in the 1920s who believed in evolution, that was a somewhat tricky thing, right, at the time. And so he was sent off to China because they didn't like him talking too much about it. His idea was, right, when he arrived to China, interestingly enough, he gets to China, gets to the desert, and he realizes the desert is probably what Earth was like, right, or at some point before there was life. And so he thought of this geosphere, right? This geosphere was the idea that you had these molecules, and you have a biosphere, which are cells, and the atmosphere, which is air, and then the noosphere. The noosphere is actually what he thought about. Instead of thinking of evolution sort of in a linear model, he thought about it in a sort of planetary model as them being layers around the planet, right? And so you have this very small thing, a larger thing, a bigger thing, and then human culture, right? Which is the noosphere is actually the human culture that encompasses the planet. And interestingly, that again does bear some resemblance to developmental neurobiology, right? Again, a spherical and sort of expansionist kind of way of thinking. And so part of going forward and trying to think about neuroemergentism is trying to see how if we think about language and we think about language learning and bilingualism as a sort of emergent process, there's always a downside to emergentism. I'll just tell you right off the bat. The downside is that it's always after the fact, right? And you can always say after the fact, oh, well, that was an emergent process. So that's part of the reason I was a little hard on emergentism. And I said, we should have neurocomputational emergentism. In other words, we should be able to observe neurocomputationally the moments before there is emergence and then the emergence process itself, right? I think that that's important to be able to do that. And I think that we have now models that can help us simulate what that might be like. Future directions are, of course, to continue studying the bilingual brain. I will, in a second, I'll put up a slide related to the emergence of skill. I'll tell you that story in a second. Looking at bilingualism and aging, of course, is another thing. I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of discussion about whether bilingualism can stave off cognitive decline. Can it stop, dementia? I think there's a lot of work still. I think it's a premature conclusion to say that the data support that. And the only reason I say that is because bilingualism is already it's not a clinical trial, right? It's not a double-blind clinical trial. Bilingualism, people who become bilingual, yes, some become by force. That's true, that does happen. But it also happens that some people become bilingual and remain bilingual for a long time. And there may be factors that influence, and there, of course, the bilingualism can affect the brain and can affect cognition, but we also have to ask the question about whether the person who became bilingual is different than the person that did not. And are all those reasons, can any of those reasons possibly have an effect on cognitive decline or not? So I think it's important to think about those and to simply put the two groups, compare them, and argue that there's a difference and that you've controlled for every factor, I think takes away the fact that this is an emergent developmental dynamic process, and that we need to understand that first before making claims about what that effect is 40 or 50 years later. I'm not trying to say that there's no effect. I'm just trying to say, I think it's a little premature for us to argue that it has to do with bilingualism, as if a person was only the receptacle of environmental and the person was not a contributor to their own environment and to their own change. And again, more on modeling of development, variations in language and cognitive development. And I have to thank all of the people who helped me out, including the Fulbright Foundation and NIH, who helped out with a lot of this research, and the Fulbright España and the Von Humboldt Foundation. That's why it's rainy, because it was in the Basque Country and in Germany, which is more rainy, I guess, than where I am in Houston, the US. And finally, I just wanted to end. I did mention the emergence of skill. The emergence of skill was the title that popped into my head 4 years ago, a little over about 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Sorry, time flies. And that title was the title of this book, which I went on to write, which took a while to write. And then Prometheus, the publisher, said, we really like your book. We really want to publish it, but can you change the title? And so, of course, it was hard because the emergence of skill was it's a nice title. The emergence of skill is a really nice, pretty idea. I like it, and it fits in with what I do. But as soon as I told everybody mastery, how learning transforms our brains, minds, and bodies, pretty much everybody said, oh yeah, much better than the emergence of skill. So I went along with the publisher. The book Mastery is coming out in April. In it, I take a lot of these neurocomputational emergentist ideas and make a sort of more trade, as they call it, trade publication version of this, using different types of skill, not just language, but also sports, chess, other types of skills, to sort of spin out an idea of how we become good at something and how that happens across time in different domains. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So So we have some time for questions, and I will go ahead and start reading those. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for giving this presentation. So our first question is from Ashley Gilliam or Gilliam. This dopamine gene has also been shown to be related to cross-cultural effects in cognition. To what extent do you think cultural exposure interacts with bilingualism to affect cognition?
Ooh, yeah, I know. I mean, this is kind of a tricky, it's a tricky gene because it's very general. And so, I mean, so yes, I think it could be related to that. I think it also could be that, you know, maybe some people find language, rewarding and language learning rewarding as well, right? So it definitely could be related to that. I think we're at the very, very beginning of trying to figure out what this relationship might be. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was a multidimensional one because I don't think, yeah, dopamine is just related to language proficiency.
Fair enough. All right, our next one is from John Muge. I've always felt that the bilingual advantage hypothesis is actually two components. One, that a second language requires additional control, and two, that this additional control spreads from the language system to other cognitive domains. But the vast majority of work that I know of only addresses the second of these. You mentioned that you and your colleagues have submitted something of a historical review. Have you found much work addressing whether a second language requires additional control?
Oh yeah, so yeah, I mean there is a literature on language control, right? So there's a debate to some extent in the bilingual literature that predates the bilingual cognitive advantage hypothesis, looking at language control and whether language control is different than cognitive control or the same thing or not. So yeah, I think it's a really valid point. I mean, the point that you would need control. I mean, this is back to the 1920s, right? So this was the idea that you could be stuck in a language or flipping between languages. The idea was that somehow this was a control aspect. Is it specific to language? Is it cognitive? Does it spread? I agree. I mean, I think control is important. If you want to use that word, or flexibility, whichever word you want to use, is important for learning a language. We feel it's hard. You have to, I mean, if you want to go to Stoko's, and that's why I really like Stoko's model of the basal ganglia prefrontal loop, that one has to really work hard when it's a new language to overcome what we would call the preponderant response, right? So yes, I would agree that there has to be a relationship there between control and learning something new. It's probably true for anything new that we do that's not automatic. I do understand your division of those two questions, and we were very happy with the first question for a while, and then the second question came in and kind of took over. But yes, I think that's a really important point.
All right, and I'll just remind our audience members to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A. Our next question is from Vera Kemp. Fascinating talk, thank you. Would you interpret the interaction between age of onset, genotype, and bilingual proficiency in the sense that individuals select into environments that help or hinder them in maintaining their two languages, depending on their genetic predisposition, much on the same way as heritability of cognitive ability increases with age?
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of the tricky part, right? Is that yeah, we do. So I mean, I like to joke that I don't like to switch. I don't like to code switch. And is that because I went to Mexico and my family, like literally I could not code switch. They did not speak English in Mexico. And and when I was here, I mean, I wouldn't code switch, but I also ate when I ate my food as a kid, I would eat my vegetables first and then I would save the meat for last. Like the yummiest part was last, besides dessert. I'm talking on the plate. So is it that I like not mixing things and that's why I don't like mixing languages? And so I find environments and I like, people look at me. The weirdest one is when I speak to Spanish speakers, native Spanish speakers, about science in Spanish, and they want to switch into English because they learned science in English. And I'm like, no, I want to talk about science in Spanish. It's all Latin words anyway. Is that me? Right? Is that my style of doing it? And that's why I'll pick certain environments or have preference for certain environments and not others. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really fascinating question. I think it goes back to the whole question of, what is the contribution of the individual to their environment? And what's the contribution of the environment to the individual, which I think is much more interactive. And anyway, I really like that question. I think that's a really valid point.
Excellent. I'll ask
I wish
a
I had an answer.
follow-up. Say it again.
I wish I had an answer.
I'll ask a follow-up question to that while I give the audience a chance to put in their questions. So related to this, and can this be incorporated into a model? Many bilinguals. So the idea of the bilingual advantage is that you have this top-down cognitive control because of the competition. But for a lot of bilinguals, there's a lot of bottom-up sort of triggers of which language to use, right? So at home, you're around your family, you speak one language, then you go to campus and you're just hearing your other language. All of your classes are in that language. So there's a lot of bottom up, therefore presumably requiring less top-down cognitive control. So I'm wondering if that can be incorporated into a model, and if you've looked at possibly this interaction. So with kids, usually the oldest, if they're from immigrants, might be the language broker. So now they're in an environment where both languages are active at the same time, compared to a sibling who is not sort of charged with being the language broker and can kind of keep the languages separate based on environments versus having to mix them. Is that something that could be incorporated into a model?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom up part is fascinating because, I mean, Francois Grosjean, right, had when I can tell a short story because we have a little bit of time. So my first year in graduate school at UC San Diego, with Liz Bates at the Center for Research and Language, on my first year, my 1 year anniversary of marriage, Francois Grosjean decides to come. So Francois Grosjean was like the person that all of us who studied bilingualism admired. Well, he was coming to campus and he was going to give a talk on my 1 year anniversary. And I had promised my wife that I would spend the day with her. And I said, oh, Francois Grosjean's coming tonight. Just go to his talk, And so we arranged to have his talk earlier in the day, well before dinner. And I could spend, a little time meeting him. But he had this idea of the monolingual and bilingual mode. I mean, he would develop these laboratory situations where they'd have a person come in, they'd come into the lab, everything was in that language. They put up posters. I mean, they tried to do this mode where it was just one language or the other language, and then they had the bilingual mode, and they would find effects of whether they were in a monolingual mode or a bilingual mode, right? And I think what this bottom up idea is, it actually, I mean, it's, I always think of it, at least for me, as a simultaneous bilingual, and this is the reason that it's tricky, right? Is that language tends to be a person, place, or thing, right? You're talking about to a person about a particular, in a particular place about a particular thing. And so people report that, oh, I can't remember this language at all. And then as soon as I get to that country, boom, it all comes back. Words just flow back into my head. And it's like, whoa, where was all this stuff? Well, it wasn't there because you were in a different context. So I do think that the environment can serve as a big cue. And that, yeah, the really hard thing was on Monday, I had to speak Brazilian Portuguese to the graduate student in my class right after class in English, after speaking English all day, after maybe having used a little bit of Spanish here and there. But I mean, it's just like, oh, that was terrible, right? So, but if we got on a plane and you dump me in the middle of Brazil and everything's in Portuguese, and probably all stuff starts coming back. So I do think the bottom up part is really interesting. And there's been some work looking at language entropy, right? The context in which you use it, work done in Montreal, which is interesting from that perspective. What was the second part of it? The second question was a different one.
Oh, well, just a way to possibly control somewhat for, say, age of acquisition would be comparing siblings. If one is the language broker, so essentially tasked with kind of interpreting for parents,
Right.
And therefore kind of managing both languages at the same time, versus a sibling who is not tasked with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a control aspect, but then I wonder if you're a language broker, do you have better proficiency? Because
Mm,
then what happens, I mean, it happened to, so I have three kids, right? My oldest is 9 years older than the youngest.
mm,
So the oldest, like I convinced my wife just Spanish for first 2 years. And so we really spoke Spanish at home, including neighbors who thought, why are you just teaching Spanish to your child, right? But she went to daycare and like in 3 months, boom, it's all, I mean, English was just like that. She was hearing it. It's just, she hadn't used it and it just came. My son, right, 3 years younger, was somewhere in between, heard Spanish, but then we went to Germany for a year. So that
mm,
year I wasn't allowed to speak Spanish to him because it's too much to do Spanish, German, and English for my son, who was not as talkative as his older sister. And then the youngest, who was, again, went some to Germany when she was young, but really it wasn't until like everybody left that then I had her to myself to only speak Spanish to, right? So I think the tricky part between the language brokering and I mean, they all have different experiences because then my son went to work with unaccompanied minors for 2 years, and so Spanish got much better, and he was able to develop proficiency in high school. So yeah, I think every path is different, and I think we need to take that into account. But I always ask whether someone who's a language broker has to be pretty proficient, and that's some pretty heavy duty proficiency training versus the younger sibling may just be passively listening and may not speak so much, may just code switch a lot. So it's tricky. I think I will say that, yeah, there's a lot of variability, even in the same family, even amongst siblings.
right, that's a good point. And of course, bilinguals have such different trajectories. We tend to use these umbrella terms of a bilingual, but they could have such vastly different experiences along with, age of when they acquired it, as well as, yeah, just how it's being used and how their parents used it and things like that. It's interesting, all the differences just within your family of what your children were exposed to. That's fascinating. All right. Well, I don't think there's any more questions that have come up. Sometimes you just give the people what they want. So I think you've done that well. Any kind of closing statement that you would like to end on?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on the mastery theme and on the language proficiency theme and on the bilingual theme, I think, one thing that a lot of bilingual researchers note and discuss a lot is just this, our individual trajectories, right? So, it's easy to, and I tell people, we know about hyperpolyglots. People can learn 11 or more languages who are, applied linguists who speak 5, 6, 7, 8 languages. Um, I think that in the end, right, we all have our own trajectories, and I think it's fascinating to think of our ability to learn two languages and to learn to do more than one thing. I think it's a really fascinating area of research, and I really look forward to all the work that people are going to do as we sort of start to get different methods to measure development and expertise. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we will see you at our next One World seminar. Everyone have a good day. Bye.